Imagine you're running for president of a club and you've worked really hard campaigning to your peers, you're fully qualified, and you just won the majority of their votes. And then suddenly the academic advisor decides he likes your opponent more than you, and you end up with nothing. How does that make you feel? This is essentially how the Electoral College works in some instances when determining the next president of the United States. And today I would like to provide you with all the evidence necessary to prove that the Electoral College is an unjust method of determining the next president, and that there are more fair and equitable processes to do so, the primary of which being the popular vote. Most likely, you all, just like me, are voting for the first time in a presidential election this year. And so this should be really important to all of you because your vote should matter, and it should matter to you, and it should be just as important as anyone else's vote in this country. And so the policy which deems the Electoral College the manner in which the U.S. president is elected is inequitable, corrupt, and more subject to change than most people believe, which is why it should be replaced with the popular vote. So the Electoral College is inequitable. The weight of which a vote in a certain state can be worth more than in another state, just based on the way that the Electoral College works. So the number of electors designated to each state is calculated by a specific formula. It's the population relative to other states plus 2 more votes equal to its representation in Senate. But do remember there is a minimum of 3 electors per state. And so this makes it a little bit unequal for those small states that, with using that calculation, would normally have less than 3 electors. Their votes are worth more. And it just makes some of the swing states really important in the election and more important than a state that's very strongly partisan. And so one of those states that is very important is Ohio. Ohio doesn't necessarily have more weight, but because it is such a narrow swing state, that their 18 delegates end up usually determining the outcome of an election. In fact, there has been no Republican presidential candidate who has won the election without winning Ohio as well. It's always been a factor in that win. And also, an entire election can be reliant on just a single state's outcome. Like I said, a more concrete example is in the 2000 election when Al Gore won the popular vote by 500,000 but lost the Electoral College in the election to George W. Bush. And so this entire victory for Bush was relying upon Florida, where Bush won by 537 votes out of the 6 million cast that night. And so to me, it seems like the 500,000 votes that Gore won should be more representative of what our country wants and believes than just 500,000 votes in Florida. Also, the Electoral College has a history of corruption. The designated elector for each state is not required to vote for the candidate that its states vote for. This is known as the faithless elector. And so an example of this is in the 2016 election, where Clinton won the national vote by 2.2%, but Trump won the Electoral College by 77 votes. In this election, there were 7 faithless electors, so 7 people who didn't vote according to their state. I'm not saying this would change the outcome of the election at all, but it seems unfair that in 7 states, the votes of its people were just completely ignored. Historically, one person has had the power to change the outcome of an election at his own benefit. In 1824, Andrew Jackson lost to John Quincy Adams despite winning the popular vote by 38,000 votes. Another person who had run in this election was Henry Clay, and by the time they got to the second part of the election, he'd been eliminated. However, if you were in APUSH, you might have heard of the corrupt bargain, because it said that Clay convinced the entire House of Representatives to vote for Adams, who then made him Secretary of State. And so he changed everyone's mind, determined the presidency just to benefit himself and move his position up in government. Lastly, electoral votes can be compromised as a means to accomplish political or military goals. In the 1876 election, Rutherford B. Hayes lost the popular vote by a majority vote to his opponent, Tilden. Tilden had been winning by 19 electoral college votes, but there were still 20 votes up for dispute. And so here comes the compromise of 1877, where all 20 of those disputed votes were given to Hayes, giving him the presidency. And all of this was part of a deal with the Republican Party to remove troops from the South to end Reconstruction. So the president was chosen as a means to end a war, which did not reflect the votes of its people. So all of these are examples of the Electoral College being corrupt. And lastly, the change within the Electoral College is more attainable and feasible than you might imagine. Many people's arguments to preserve the Electoral College is that it gives small states a more equal chance as with a really big state to have their vote heard. And that's totally true. I'm not going to argue with that, but it seems to me that the small benefit a smaller state receives from the Electoral College does not outweigh the wishes and the opinions and the votes of an entire country's population. Another argument is that it would be un-American to reform such a historical and traditional system. But in terms of maintaining tradition, there are examples of many countries across the world who have changed their method of voting with positive results. In France, they once had a system much like our Electoral College, but they recently changed that to have a two-part popular vote election. So if one candidate does not win the popular vote in the first part, then they remove the extra candidates, they narrow it down to two, and then they vote again, and whoever wins the majority wins. And you may argue that France is a much smaller and less politically polarized country than us, so another country who did the exact same thing as them and votes in the exact same manner is Indonesia. And while you might not think, it is actually a lot closer to our our voter turnout numbers. And so there's actually already a petition among a lot of U.S. states to turn to a more popular vote-based election. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and it's an agreement that has been adopted by 15 states so far, and D.C. And basically they've agreed that whichever candidate wins the popular vote in their state will be receiving all of their electoral votes in that election. And so this will only go into effect once they have a majority of electors to agree. So they would need 270, and right now they only have 196. But it shows that a lot of states believe that going to a more popular vote-based system would be a lot more equitable and fair to everyone. And so the utilization of the Electoral College in the presidential election should be replaced with the popular vote in order to preserve and restore past, present, and future equity and democracy within the U.S. The use of the Electoral College makes votes within certain extreme states futile and makes voting in these areas discouraging. There is a history of cases in which the Electoral College does not match the popular vote, meaning that the people in charge of our government sometimes don't respect the wishes of their people. Lastly, there's already a movement in several states to adopt a policy that maintains the integrity of the popular vote as best it can. So considering the extremely diverse opinions and the constantly changing nature of our country and its people, it's absolutely crucial that everyone's vote is validated and heard, and the popular vote is the best way to do so.